So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! The NFL Draft is just 8 days away. In 8 days, the Detroit Lions will be on the clock and they will have a decision to make that could impact the future of their franchise forever. And with that being said, with just a week left to go, the Detroit Lions have had quite a few top 30 visits and will still continue to have a number of top 30 visits throughout the rest of this week leading up to the NFL Draft. Now, I think the top 30 visits are kind of an important thing to look at because I think it gives you a really good idea of, one, where the Detroit Lions mindset is as far as what positions they're looking to draft and what players they're looking to draft at each position, but also just kind of giving you a good idea of what prospects the Lions are looking at, what value they might want to take a certain position, and overall just get a good idea of the foundation the Lions are laying for this class. Now, taking a look at last year's class, the Detroit Lions had a number of top 30 visits end up being Lions a season ago. These players include guys like Hendon Hooker, the third-round selection from Tennessee, Adrian Martinez, the undrafted rookie quarterback from Kansas State, Antoine Green, the seventh-round wide receiver from North Carolina, Sam Laporta and Brian Branch, a pair of second-round picks from Iowa and Alabama, respectively. However, funnily enough, the Detroit Lions actually had a top 30 visit with neither of their two first-round picks, of course, being Jack Campbell and Jahmyr Gibbs. So even though that the top 30 visits can give you a good idea of who the Lions may be looking at and what positions they may be valuing, it's not an end-all, be-all to being a Lion or not being a Detroit Lion. So with that being said, I just thought it would be a good idea to take a look at the top 30 visits so far, take a look at the positions the Lions seem to value, the value they're putting on certain positions, and just overall get a good idea of maybe the mindset of the Detroit Lions going into the 2024 NFL Draft. So with that being said, let's start off with the sole offensive player to have a top 30 visit so far be reported, and that, of course, is Giovanni Manu, the 6'8", 340-pound offensive guard from the CFL. Now, offensive line stats are really hard to find in the NFL, so finding them in the CFL is nearly impossible without just watching every single snap of every single game. And quite honestly, with the draft fastly approaching, I don't quite have time to watch every single snap of a CFL team this year, but I do know that he was a very good player, and from the limited snaps that I have watched, I think he could be a really strong player on day 3 of the draft. He has elite size for a tackle, being 6'8", 340 pounds. He isn't necessarily the quickest or the fastest guy, but he does have really good reach and does have some really good play strength. And I can tell you for a fact that last season with his CFL team, with the Thunderbirds, he allowed just a single sack on the season, while his offense averaged 439 yards per game, while having 1,444 rushing yards, which led the CFL a season ago. Now, Giovanni Manu is a very raw prospect. I think he has a lot of polishing left to do, but I do think if you get into the 7th round, if you get into the undrafted free agent category and you have Giovanni Manu on your board, you have him available, you give him a call, I think he could be a really solid prospect. I think he's got a lot of tools to work with. He's got the great size. I think he has really good play strength. There are some really good run blocking clips. And I think he could be this year's Colby Sorsdale and a player that the Lions like out of a small school, a player that not a lot of people know about, and a guy that could just end up being a really good depth rotational piece, as well as a potential plug-and-play starter in the event of a major injury. However, as I said, that was the only offensive player that I could find to have confirmed a top 30 visit with the Detroit Lions this offseason, while the rest of them seem to be on the defensive side of the ball, and a lot of them seem to be heavily in the secondary. But before we get to those guys, let's take a look at the front 7 players that they've brought in for a top 30 visit, starting off with edge rusher Marshawn Nealon. Now, Marshawn Nealon is a little bit of an undersized edge rusher and doesn't quite have the prototypical bend you'd want to see out of an edge rusher in the NFL. Standing at 6'3", 265 pounds, Marshawn Nealon was not necessarily as effective on the stat sheet as you would expect when watching his tape. He had 4.5 sacks, 7.5 tackles for loss, but this kid is a wrecking ball. He is going to get a lot of pressure. He is relentless in his pursuit. And even though he's not the most polished product, even though he does get stuffed sometimes, and even though if the offensive lineman does get a good set on him, he probably won't be able to react with a second counter move. Marshawn Nealon is really quick off the line, has a great first step, is super explosive, is really powerful. And I do think as a potential 3rd to 4th round prospect, you're looking at a player that could impact on day one, be a rotational pass rusher, kind of be just a wrecking ball of fire in the middle. And I do think there is some value of Marshawn Nealon, although I don't think it's going to be in the 1st or 2nd rounds. I think he is more of a mid to late 3rd round, if not a early day 3 type of prospect. However, the Lions interviewed a couple other defensive linemen in this class, including Michael Hall, the 6'3", 290-pound interior defensive lineman from Ohio State. Now, last year, he had just a sack and a half and 2 tackles for loss on the year. The year before that, in his junior season, he was a little bit better. I believe had 4.5 sacks and 7.5 tackles for loss, but again, much like Marshawn Nealon, Michael Hall looks like he'd be much more productive than he actually was for the Ohio State Buckeyes. He is super explosive off the snap. He's got a great first step. He is incredibly quick off the line. He's got actually some really solid pass rushing moves in his arsenal as well. He's a solid run defender. He's a solid pass rusher. And for whatever reason, he just never seems to be the guy to finish the play. He's always the guy that forces the quarterback to step up into pressure. He's always the guy that, is the first to the backfield and forces the running back to stop his feet. He's always the guy that ends up being in the right spot. But for some reason, he just never seems to be the guy that finishes the play, meaning he's probably going to fall in the draft because of his subpar statistical success. But I do think as a 2nd to 3rd round player, Michael Hall would bring some good explosiveness to the defense, would bring some good pass rush to the defense, and would be a really solid contributor overall as a year 1 product, while potentially being a long-term solution at the other defensive tackle position. Christian Boyd's another player that's been brought in for a top 30 visit. I believe he was actually the first player to be brought in as a top 30 visit for the Detroit Lions. 3 sacks a season ago, 9 hits and 28 quarterback pressures. He is a player that, again, much like Michael Hall, I think looks better on tape than he does on the stat sheet. His stats aren't very good. He didn't put up very big numbers, but he is an explosive player. He's big, 6'4", really, really strong, has some good play strength, has a lot of tools that you could really like out of a defensive tackle. But of course, needs to put those tools to good use and needs to start using them properly in order to put up big numbers as a pass rusher. I think Christian Boyd is a kind of sleeper in this class, although a lot of people really like him as a sleeper in this class. I think he's going to be a early day 3 type of prospect, a very, very unpolished player, but a player with some really good upside. I think there is something to work with there, and so do the Detroit Lions. And my favorite defensive tackle from this class is going to be Johnny Newton, the player that was recently, I believe the most recent top 30 visit of the Detroit Lions, having 8.5 sacks a season ago, 7.5 tackles for loss, while being the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year while suffering through an injury for a majority of his final collegiate season. I think Johnny Newton is exactly what the Lions want in a pass rusher. I think he's exactly what the Lions want in a defensive lineman. He's a good leader for the Illinois defense. He is a great player. All around, Johnny Newton, I think, is the best defensive tackle in this class. And because of the injuries, because of a quiet offseason, Johnny Newton probably will fall into the late 1st round. But I do think if he hits a certain point in the draft, you are going to see the Lions either trade up for him or just take him at 29 if he continues to fall. So those are the defensive linemen the Lions have taken a look at, and now we're going to take a look at the cornerbacks, and we've talked about a couple of already. So I don't want to, recap, and I don't want to say the same things over and over again. So I will just mention that these 4 cornerbacks we've talked about before in previous videos. Teron Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry from Alabama have both been brought in for top 30 visits, who are both going to be likely 1st-round picks, as well as Quantez Sitgers, as well as Nehemiah Pritchard. Both of them, I think, are going to be late round, if not UDFA talents that the Lions really like potentially for some special teams value and some special teams juice. So getting onto the new prospects at cornerback, because there are more, Ennis Rakestraw was recently brought in for a top 30 visit. Now, I am not nearly as high on Ennis Rakestraw as a lot of other people seem to be. Some people mock him as a late 1st-round pick, even as going as far to mock him to the Detroit Lions. in the first round. I don't necessarily think he is that type of player. I think he is a pure second round guy. I think his lack of speed really hurts him. He doesn't necessarily have exceptional length. And even though he does have really good instincts on the boundary, last year wasn't the best year for Ennis, right? 64% completion percentage, 197 yards allowed, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Definitely not a bad season in the SEC, but he only has 1 career interception, and it came off of a jumped screen pass. I don't see him getting beat too often down the field, but I also don't see him making too many plays in the secondary. I think he is a strong day 2 candidate, but I don't necessarily see him sneaking into round 1. I just don't think he has the long speed to be successful, and I don't necessarily think he's going to be a top-end cornerback for an NFL team, likely more of a cornerback 2 or a special teams / depth option. Another cornerback that I'm not incredibly high on, this seems to be a theme with top 30 visits, is Kalen Carson, a player that I have drafted and I have graded as a late day 3 prospect at best. Some people have him as a second round selection. I personally just do not see it. I don't think he plays the ball very well in the air. He allowed a 56% completion percentage last year at Wake Forest. Allowed 436 yards through the air, 4 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. I actually believe, much like Rakestraw, he has just 1 interception on his entire career. Now, to Carson's credit, I do think he tackles really well. I do think he is a good physical cornerback who will step up and make some hits, but I personally just don't see him as anything more than a special teams contributor. And for that, I can't put him any higher on my draft grades than a strong day 3, round 6 to 7 prospect who is going to be a special teams contributor, but will probably never, ever see the field as a starting cornerback. And a very similar thing goes for the last cornerback the Lions have brought in. Andrew Phillips last year with Kentucky allowed a 67% completion percentage when targeted, allowed 438 yards, 4 touchdowns, and has never had an interception in his collegiate career. Now, Andrew Phillips, again, is a player that I have seen mocked as high as the late 3rd round, somewhere in the 110s to 115s. And again, personally, I just don't see it. I don't see too many traits that I love out of Andrew Phillips. His stat sheet and the play that he put on the field isn't anything incredible. And even his best game a season ago versus Clemson was just an average performance by the metrics of most other cornerbacks in this class. So I do think the Detroit Lions are doing a lot of their homework on some of the late round prospects, some of the late round guys that they've brought in, because I think they know who they want with their top picks. I think they know what they want with 29. They know who they want in the rounds with, the 61 to 73 range. They know who they want with their 1st, 2nd, and 3rd round picks. So I think they're doing a lot of homework on the day 3 guys. And even though I think Kalen Carson and Andrew Phillips potentially will be overdrafted, there's a chance that a lot of people see what I see and that they do fall to the late day 3, if not even undrafted rookie free agency. And I think at that point, you're still looking at guys that you want to bring in, guys that can contribute on special teams, guys that can replace Chase Lucas, guys that can join the special teams and be a major impact and be a player that is noteworthy. And I think that that's going to be what these type of players have to be in the NFL, because I don't think they'll be starting on the boundary. But the Lions have had some success in the draft, obviously, the last couple of years. If they are drafted by the Detroit Lions, I will trust Brad Holmes and the process. But as of right now, those are the top 30 visits for the Detroit Lions. A ton of cornerbacks, a couple of defensive tackles, 1 edge rusher, and 1 offensive lineman. Last year, the list was significantly longer, so I'm not sure if they just aren't being reported as top 30 visits, if the sources just aren't getting out as well this year, or if the Lions are just simply bringing in less players for their top 30 visits this year. That's, I don't necessarily know what is going on, but it seems to be like there are less visits this year than there were last. But with all of that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Those are the top 30 visits that have been reported by the Detroit Lions as of today. With 8 days left to go to the draft, there's a possibility that more top 30 visits happen, as well as more get reported that have already potentially happened with the Detroit Lions. But as of right now, those are the only ones I can say for certain have happened. So take that as you may. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Let me know down in the comments below how you feel about this draft class, how you feel about the top 30 visits, and what players you want to see drafted by the Lions. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so very much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.